Right, so we're going to unpack some stuff here. You sent over some really fascinating things today.
Right.
We've got the Gambler's Ruin Project, which comes with a responsible gambling disclaimer. I always like to see that.
Absolutely.
We've also got a really detailed match analysis report for an upcoming Premier League clash. This is Wolverhampton Wanderers versus Tottenham Hotspur. So it looks like we are taking a deep dive into the world of sports predictions and the probabilities behind them. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to figure out what this report is trying to tell us about the match beyond just, who might win or who might lose. What are the data points hinting at?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. We tend to think about, who's going to win or who's going to lose, but we don't always think about, what other information can we glean from the data that we have?
Yeah.
And this is a really comprehensive breakdown. We've got everything from team form and recent performance and key player stats, expected goals, those kind of things. Historical, head-to-heads. How have they performed against each other historically? We've got outputs from several different statistical models, which are really designed to forecast the outcome of the match, and also a peek into the betting markets. So what are the betting markets saying?
Right.
And, even an analysis using something called the Kelly criterion to assess potential betting value.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and this is really what stood out to me when I was looking at all this. The report indicates that Wolverhampton has like a slight edge according to their models. But it's only slight. We're talking around 41% probability. The chance of a draw is surprisingly high.
Right.
At almost 35%.
Yeah.
Tottenham's win probability, according to these models, is just under 25%. So right away, you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, this isn't a clear cut. One team is definitely going to beat the other.
No, absolutely. And, it's easy to get caught up in, well, who's going to be the winner and the loser. But, football is a low-scoring game, and draws are, a very real possibility. And what this is suggesting is that in this particular encounter, that is actually a very real and perhaps an underestimated possibility.
So let's get into what's actually creating those probabilities, because there's a lot of data here. So we see that Wolverhampton's recent form has been a bit of a mixed bag. Some wins, some losses, a draw in there, but they've been stronger at home.
Right.
Tottenham, on the other hand, have had inconsistent results away from their home ground.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is that the average goals scored and conceded per match is very similar between the two sides.
I think what's interesting here is how the models are weighting that home advantage for Wolverhampton.
Right.
Because, even with their slightly inconsistent form, playing at home at Molineux seems to give them a little bit of a boost.
Yeah.
And Tottenham's away form definitely plays into that lower win probability.
Right.
I think the fact that both teams are, quite evenly matched in terms of goals scored and conceded really reinforces that idea that this could be a very tight game.
And then when you look at the individual players, Matheus Cunha for Wolves is highlighted as having a decent expected goals per 90 minutes. He's been scoring recently as well. For Tottenham, you've got Son Heung-min. He's their main threat with a higher expected goals per 90, and he's had recent goals and assists. And then James Maddison as well. They highlight him as a playmaker. He's had a lot of assists recently.
Yeah, this is great because it gives you an idea of, where the key moments in the game might come from. Cunha's stats suggest that he's getting in dangerous scoring positions for Wolves.
Yeah.
And the goals back that up. He's converting those chances. And for Tottenham, it's no surprise to see Son, he's consistently high XG and goal contributions.
Right.
He's their go-to guy in attack. And then you've got Maddison who's setting up those opportunities.
Yeah.
So, you've got some influential attackers on both sides, which adds another layer to how this match might pan out.
And then if you look back at the head-to-head history between the two teams, Tottenham have actually won more of the last 5 encounters, but Wolves have won the last 2 home games against them.
Right.
So that to me seems really significant.
It is, yeah. And I think that's what's contributing to the models, sort of slight lean towards a Wolverhampton win at home. While the broader historical record might favor Tottenham.
Right.
Those recent results at Molineux are a strong indicator that perhaps the dynamic has shifted a little bit when these two teams play there. And I'm sure the models are giving significant weight to that recent home form.
Yeah. And they actually use a bunch of different models here. So they've got XG Boost, they've got a neural network, a Bayesian model, random forest, and they even did a bagging ensemble, which is a combination of these models.
Right.
And all of them independently suggest a slightly higher probability of a Wolverhampton win.
That's amazing.
Which is really
yeah.
fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And then the stacked model probability reinforces this, gives specific percentages.
Yeah.
For Wolves, win, a draw, and a Tottenham win, along with confidence intervals.
Yeah, I think what's great here is despite these models using very different statistical approaches
Yeah.
and looking at the data from slightly different angles, they all come to the same conclusion.
Right.
Which is, Wolves' slight edge. And that really adds to the robustness of the finding. It suggests that it's not a quirk of one specific model.
Right.
The bagging ensemble, by taking into account all those individual predictions, gives an even more robust overall probability. And those confidence intervals are useful.
Right.
Because it gives you a sense of the range of potential outcomes around those main probabilities.
Yeah, and the visualizations they put in here are really interesting as well. The predicted match outcome probabilities, they have like a pie chart. And it's really clear that Wolverhampton have a narrow lead, but the draw is huge.
Yeah.
It's a massive part of that pie chart. And then the Monte Carlo simulations, which essentially run the match 10,000 times based on the data, echo those same probabilities.
Yeah, and I think, what's great about the visuals is it just tells the story so clearly.
Yeah.
The pie chart immediately jumps out at you.
Yeah.
The draw is not some unlikely outcome.
Yeah.
It's a very plausible one, almost on par with the Wolverhampton victory. And then the Monte Carlo simulations really drive that point home.
Yeah.
By showing across thousands of simulated matches, the draw occurs.
Yeah.
A significant percentage at the time, in line with what the models are predicting.
And now here's where it gets really, really interesting to me.
Right.
When you compare the model's probabilities to the betting market odds, the market odds suggest a higher chance of a Wolverhampton win than the models do, but they underestimate the probability of a draw significantly.
Okay.
And that's a key thing here. And they even suggest in the report that there might be some value in betting on a draw if you can get odds of 3.80 or higher.
Oh.
However, they use something called the Kelly criterion, which is a method for optimal bet sizing. And they recommend against placing any bets at the current odds because they don't believe any of them offer a positive expected value.
I think this is where it gets really interesting, where the theoretical meets the practical.
Right.
Especially if you're thinking about having a bet.
Right.
The models are giving us one perspective on the probabilities.
Yeah.
And then you've got the collective betting public as reflected in the odds.
Right.
And they have a slightly different view.
Yeah.
And the fact that they seem to be undervaluing the likelihood of a draw, according to the models, could represent, potentially an inefficiency in the market. However, that recommendation from the Kelly criterion analysis is key.
Yeah.
It's taking into account not just do we have an edge?
Yeah.
But also, how big is that potential payout relative to the risk?
Yeah.
And in this case, it's suggesting that even though, the draw looks like good value based on the probabilities, the odds aren't quite high enough to make it a mathematically sound bet at the moment.
So what does this all mean for someone who's trying to get a handle on this match?
Right.
Well, the statistical models are giving Wolverhampton a slight advantage, but that huge probability of a draw, which the market seems to be overlooking, is suggesting a very unpredictable match. The report is advising people to be cautious with large pre-match bets.
Right.
But it says that live betting might offer some better opportunities as you see how the game is unfolding. And they even give a couple of fun bets to consider, like a 1-1 correct score or under 2.5 total goals. And to me, that really reflects this expectation that it's going to be a tight, potentially low-scoring game.
I think, if we connect this back to the bigger picture of sports analysis, it really highlights the inherent uncertainty in football.
Right.
Even with all of this detailed data and sophisticated modeling, trying to predict with certainty the exact outcome remains impossible. That advice to be careful with large pre-match bets and to consider live betting, I think emphasizes the importance of actually seeing how the game unfolds and that flow and the momentum and those fun bets. They're quite interesting as well because I think they align with this overall statistical picture that we've seen, a close, low-scoring match where a 1-1 draw It wouldn't be at all surprising.
So essentially, going into this match, you shouldn't have a strong conviction about either team really winning, and you should be very aware that a draw is a real possibility.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment.
So let's recap this deep dive. You came to us with information suggesting this Premier League match between Wolverhampton and Tottenham is anything but a sure thing.
Right.
And while the statistical models give Wolves a slight advantage, the data strongly indicates a high likelihood of a draw, a possibility that the betting market seems to be overlooking.
I think that's a good way to put it. We've seen how multiple different lines of evidence, from recent team form and head-to-head results to the outputs of several different predictive models all converge on this picture of, a closely contested match with a very, significant chance of ending in a draw.
This raises an important question to me now, and to you, I'm sure, is how do you interpret these discrepancies between what the statistical models are saying and what the market sentiment as reflected in the odds suggests? Does the market know something that the models don't, or is this an inefficiency you could capitalize on? Right. Albeit cautiously, because the report advises against any strong pre-match bets.
Yeah, that's the fundamental question. When you're looking at any kind of predictive modeling in a dynamic environment, like a sports market, the betting market represents the collective beliefs and wagers of a huge number of people. And it might well be incorporating factors that are very difficult for even the most sophisticated models to quantify, things like team morale, last-minute injury news, even subtle tactical shifts that might be happening. On the other hand, if your models are robust and well-calibrated, these discrepancies can indeed point to potential inefficiencies where the market hasn't quite caught up to the underlying probabilities.
What I think is fascinating about all this is the attempt to quantify the inherent unpredictability of a football match. These models take into account all this data, from team form to individual player performance. Even how they've played against each other in the past, but the market, which is driven by people placing bets, paints a slightly different picture.
It really underscores the complexity of trying to forecast real-world events. Especially those involving, human factors and that degree of randomness. Like a football match. Data-driven analysis provides incredibly valuable insights. Helps us understand those underlying probabilities. But that inherent uncertainty of sport means there will always be a gap between prediction and reality.
So this deep dive has really highlighted the nuances involved in trying to figure out the likely outcome of an event, even with this data-rich approach. It really emphasizes to me the importance of looking beyond simple win probabilities and actually considering all the potential outcomes, especially the often overlooked draw.
And I think, a more nuanced understanding of the probabilities of play, rather than just focusing on that most favored outcome, allows for a much more informed perspective. Whether you're a better, you're an analyst trying to understand the game or simply, a curious observer.
So as you go about your day, think about how often you look at situations and only focus on the most obvious or expected outcome. And are you missing other significant possibilities? Because the data here reminds us that sometimes that less flashy option, the draw, the compromise, the less dramatic result can be just as, if not more likely.
I think that's a really good point.
So it's a good reminder to consider all the perspectives and the nuances in any set of information.
Absolutely. I think that's a great takeaway.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It was a fascinating set of data to unpack.
It really was. I enjoyed that. Thanks for having me.
Okay. I'll see you next time.
See you later.